Van Wengert. Winds it up, delivers. Tomey drills one high and deep to center. Away, way back. Gone deep into the picnic plaza, and that might have even got out of the ballpark. Jim Tomey has just left Jacobs Field onto Eagle Avenue. That will take 2 tape measures.
Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 3 of Just a Bit Outside, our Cleveland Indians podcast here on the Buckeye Scoop Network. Appreciate you all joining me today, and we decided to call this episode Wake Up the Bats, and for good reason. It was a rough weekend for Cleveland Indians hitters, and the Indians are in a much different position today than they were heading into last week's episode. Everyone was feeling good coming out of that opening weekend against the Kansas City Royals. The Indians looked pretty good against the White Sox, and a lot of people were feeling optimistic about this team, especially watching this rotation go out game after game, night after night, and really shut down the opponents. We saw more of that over the weekend against Minnesota. We've seen a little bit of that already in the series here against the Cincinnati Reds. But unfortunately, the Indians do not have much to show for it. This lineup has completely fallen apart, and that started really last week into the weekend against the Minnesota Twins, which is really the worst team, in my opinion, that you could fall apart against. Now, give the Twins a lot of credit. They are a good baseball team. They are certainly now the front runners to win the AL Central. Maybe that would have been the case if this was a 162-game season. We would all be sitting here saying, hey, we've got a long way to go. It's still April. It's cold. The Indians will hit at some point. Just give it time. But we don't have that luxury. In this world of COVID-19, we do not have the luxury of time, at least not the way that we used to. And so the Indians are now sitting here, and we're 11 games into the season. They are sitting here at 5-6, and this season is moving in a hurry. And so you've got 49 games left in this season, and where we're sitting today, again, I don't want to overreact, but where we're sitting today, this does not look like a team that can compete for anything maybe more than a division title. And right now, they certainly don't look like they're on the same level as the Minnesota Twins, especially with some of the additions that the Twins have made to that lineup this season. But they don't look like a team that can really compete. And maybe they can come back and compete with the Twins. Obviously, that series was in Minnesota. It was their first road trip, really, of the season. And so not going to hold them completely accountable for, a meltdown, losing 3 out of 4 against the Twins over the weekend. But, not good. It did not look good. And, again, there were a lot of takeaways from that series that I think lead us to some serious questions about the Indians and whether they have the type of team that can certainly compete for a division title. And then, do they have a team that could potentially do anything more than that? Are the Indians going to put themselves in a position to compete for something? And when you watch teams like the Boston Red Sox and you watch teams like the New York Yankees, it is tough. It is tough to watch, Aaron Judge go up there pretty much every at-bat and look like he is going to put one into the seats, put one off the wall, do something dangerous every time he steps up to the plate. And so it's hard to imagine this Indians team competing against those teams, and for obvious reasons, right? The Indians don't have the budget, they don't have the ownership, they're not able to sign guys and make trades for guys like Gio Stanton and be able to bring in some of the talent that the Yankees have brought in. But outside of the Yankees, the Minnesota Twins are not a team that has historically spent a ton of money, and yet here they are with a fantastic lineup and a team that I think can really compete. Maybe not for a World Series or even an AL pennant. I'm not sure they have the pitching rotation for that, but they certainly have a really strong lineup top to bottom. And, the Indians, even when they had a chance, even when they were facing a bullpen day from the Minnesota Twins, they still couldn't get anything going over the weekend. And so a lot to break into on today's show. We are going to break this up by a few different topics. The first one we're going to cover today is around that very subject, and it was something that I had someone reach out to me on Twitter and ask me about, which is, will the Indians ever score again? Or will they score more than, 1 or 2 runs? How good can this team be with the current lineup? So we know what we know today, but what do we think this team could look like long term? Is this just a slow start for these bats? Is it just a bump in the road? Or is there something more nefarious at work here when we think about the potential for the Indians this season? We're going to talk a little bit about a new segment that I'm adding to this podcast called The Tribe Throwback. Potentially we'll come up with a better name, but for now it's going to be The Tribe Throwback because we're going to revisit Grady Sizemore and the trade for Grady Sizemore that the Indians made. And then our final topic for this episode will be getting into Mike Clevenger. And what's up with Mike Clevenger? Is this something that we should expect to continue? Or do we think that Mike Clevenger will at some point turn things around, get back on track? And what should people expect from Mike Clevenger moving forward? But before we get into that, want to start this episode really the way we should probably start every episode, which is the Shane Bieber appreciation and the Shane Bieber watch list. Taking a look at the Indians ace, who was fantastic yet again in the first game of the series against the Twins, the only game that the Indians did win. So he was fantastic again. We'll get into that a little bit. And so, I think that was really the highlight. If you're looking for a positive highlight, that was the highlight, that Shane Bieber was really unhittable in the opening game of this series. He struck out another 14 hitters in this game. And so, really he has just become one of the best pitchers in baseball. Not overnight. He was a really good pitcher in 2019, but he has really established himself as a guy who could compete for the Cy Young if the Indians are going to give him enough support. Right now you're in a position where Shane Bieber, anyone else in this pitching staff, you almost feel like they've got to give you 8 innings of shutout baseball or pretty darn near close for you to feel like you've got this in the bag, for you to feel confident that the Indians have this game. When you think about the lack of hitting, when you think about Brad Hand and some of the issues that he's having on the back end of this bullpen, they're going to need Shane Bieber to be great every night, every time he takes the mound. And so far he has been. In fact, he's been historically great through his first 2 starts of the season. He's 2-0 on the year with a 0.00 ERA. I hear that's pretty good. He has struck out 27 batters in just 14 innings, which ties a record set by Carl Spooner of the Dodgers, not the Los Angeles Dodgers, but the Brooklyn Dodgers. Back in 1954, Carl Spooner started the season with 27 punch-outs in his first 2 starts, and so Shane Bieber has entered rare air and is really a part of history here with 27 strikeouts in his first 2 starts, has not allowed a run thus far, and he was masterful again in that game against the Twins. The 25-year-old right-hander, he went 6 innings of shutout baseball, struck out, as I mentioned, another 14 batters, but to me, this was far more impressive than the 13 he struck out in the opener against the Royals, because this, again, is a pretty good Minnesota Twins lineup. Now, they're not the Yankees. He wasn't going up against, some of the best players in the American League necessarily, but they've got a great lineup top to bottom. They've got guys who really know how to battle and really know how to hit, and they put a lot of balls into the seats. So if you make a mistake against that Minnesota Twins lineup, they're going to make you pay. And they could not touch Shane Bieber on Thursday night. He was in total control of that game from start to finish. In fact, a buddy of mine up in Minneapolis was texting me during the game about how unfair that game was and how he felt like the Twins hitters really had no chance every time that they came up to the plate. You're talking about some really good hitters, and they just had no chance against Shane Bieber. He was masterful in that game against the Twins. And the Indians, pitching on the season, especially their starters, have been fantastic this year, especially if you take out Mike Clevenger. And we're going to get into Mike Clevenger this season. But Shane Bieber, a 0.00 ERA. Zach Plesac, who we'll talk a little bit about, had a 1.80 ERA or has a 1.80 ERA on the season. Cookie Carrasco didn't have his best stuff over the weekend, but both Carrasco and Aaron Savale have a 3.75 ERA. Adam Plutko has a 3.00 ERA in his one start on the year. So they have 6 guys right now that you feel comfortable with, although, again, Mike Clevenger sitting there at 4.91 ERA. You've got to wonder what's going on there. But the bullpen has done a pretty good job. When you think about some of these other guys like Nick Whitgren and Cam Hill and even Adam Simber, the problem has been Brad Hand on the back end of the bullpen, and we'll get into some of the issues with Brad Hand. But before we get into that, we've got to start with the most important thing, the biggest question facing the Cleveland Indians right now, which is, will they ever score again? Will this Indians team ever put it together? Are they going to be a team that can actually score some runs, back up this pitching staff, and reestablish themselves as a contender in the American League? Or are we going to get to watch another season of Indians pitchers having fantastic stuff, putting together a number of quality starts in a row, and really not getting any support? We've seen too much of that over the last few years. And so that's got to make you a little bit nervous when you think about the way that this Indians team has really transformed itself from a team in the 1990s that had one of the most feared lineups in all of baseball with Albert Bell and Manny Ramirez and Kenny Lofton and Jim Thome and all the guys that made up that fantastic 90s team, but they had zero pitching in the 90s, or close to zero, especially when it mattered. And now they've kind of gone the other direction. They have fantastic starting pitching, and they have for a while. I mean, if you go back and look at the 6 guys they've got now, but you go back, they had Corey Kluber, Trevor Bauer. I mean, they've had a number of great starters over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and I feel like we run into this same problem every year. And, of course, that may go back to ownership. That may go back to the fact that, they're not willing to pay for any of these big power bats that you need. They're not even willing to retain guys like Michael Brantley, who was certainly one of the best outfielders in baseball last season with the Houston Astros. And obviously he had some injury history in Cleveland, but when you're not able to bring a guy like Michael Brantley back, that leaves you where you are today, with one of the worst hitting outfields in baseball and major question marks about whether this team can really compete given the lineup that they have today. And so we're going to talk about that on this episode and kick us off with a little bit of an overview on whether we think this Indians team is going to turn it around, or is this who they're going to be for the rest of the season. The Indians are hitting just a $190 as a team heading into Tuesday night's game against the Reds. They have a .282 on base percentage and are slugging .277 over the first 11 games. They're striking out nearly 30% of the time, and I can tell you, if you've been watching the games, you already know those numbers look every bit as bad in person as they sound on paper. There was a point the other night where I was watching the game, and they had gone 1-2-3. Essentially, their first 3 hitters had gotten out 10 times in the course of 15 innings. That's not going to do much for you, and really, that's been the issue with this team. They have not been able to get anything going and not been able to string anything together. Really, the only 2 players that have even managed to hit their body weight so far this season are Jose Ramirez and Cesar Hernandez. Hernandez is a good addition. That's somebody that you were hoping could add something to this team, so it's good to see that he's been able to do a little bit with that leadoff spot. He looks like a guy who knows how to get on base. He's hitting .297 on the year with a .381 on base percentage. And so I think Hernandez is one of the few bright spots on this team, at least when it comes to the lineup. And then Jose Ramirez, he was hitting .375. He got hot last weekend into the middle of last week, but he's cooled off. He's down to .300, which is significantly better than basically anyone else on this roster other than Cesar Hernandez. And then your next best hitters are going to be Bradley Zimmer, who was quietly hitting 294, but he's cooled off. He's down to 250. And Frankie Lindor, who's actually gotten hot, had the home run the other night and to start off the game, basically, and finally got his average up to 250. So that's what you're dealing with here. And then from there, it is just ugly. It is really, really ugly. The rest of this lineup, when you go from those top few guys, those top four guys, really, if you want to include Bradley Zimmer, and you start looking at the rest of the lineup, it gets very ugly very quickly. So Carlos Santana is hitting 200 on the season. Franmil Reyes is hitting a .171 with 12 strikeouts. Domingo Santana, 158. And so this just gets ugly. Sandy Leon, who's now your starting catcher right now, while Roberto Perez is out with injury, he's hitting a .33. And then you have Oscar Mercado, who's a guy who they were hoping would come back around and be more like the player he was in the first half of last season. That has not happened. He is hitting just a .07 and has just 3 hits in his first 28 at-bats on the season. So it has been a rough start, and again, you have Sandy Leon as your everyday catcher. You have Bo Taylor as your backup, who is now 0 for 8 on the season. And then you have Jordan Luplow and Greg Allen, who came into Tuesday night 0 for 20 on the season combined between the two of them. So those are guys that you expected would contribute in some capacity, and so far they've given you one big donut. And so you hope that at some point these numbers have to come back around a little bit. They have to, normalize to some extent. You wouldn't expect Jordan Luplow and Greg Allen to hit 0-0-0 the rest of the season. You wouldn't expect Carlos Santana to finish the year hitting 200. And hopefully at some point you would expect Franmil Reyes to start doing something. He has 0 home runs, 2 RBIs on the season. He does have 1 double. But has really not given you anything. He's slugging 200, and you're getting next to nothing next from the guy that you thought was going to be, a middle-of-the-order type guy. And so you would hope that eventually Franmil Reyes is going to be a guy who gets hot, who can put some balls in the seats, and this is a guy who hit 37 home runs last season, but he has looked completely lost up there this season. I'm not just talking about the numbers. When you watch this guy hit, he looks completely lost. He looks like a guy who's just chasing pitches, and it looks very, very easy to set him up right now. If you throw the fastball high and then you come back with some breaking balls, it looks like this guy has no chance. And so, again, part of that is, he's in a little bit of a funk to start the season, but the other part is you got to wonder, can he be that guy they need him to be? And when can he be that guy? If you've only got 49 more games in the season, you don't have weeks and weeks and weeks for Franmil Reyes to figure this out. And the same with the rest of these guys. At one point, we thought that Domingo Santana was going to be a long shot to make the team. And now you're talking about a guy who is a mainstay really in this lineup. And when he's not hitting or he's not in the lineup, then you're going with an unproven guy like Daniel Johnson, who's 1 for 12 on the season, hitting .083. And so there aren't really a lot of options right now for Terry Francona. There aren't really a lot of ways for him to go with this, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Mercado is a guy who, again, looked like a 5-star player, 5-tool player in the first half of last season, and he's looked completely overwhelmed this year, and really dating back to August of last year, has not looked like the same player, and you got to wonder, is he going to be able to even be an everyday player? At some point you might just throw Bradley Zimmer in center field and hope that he figures it out, because you can't have a guy like Mercado hitting a .07 when everybody else in the lineup is struggling as well. Then you have a guy like Jordan Luplow. Again, he's 0 for 13 or 0 for 12, I should say, on the season. And that's a guy who hit .320 last year against left-handed pitching. But is that sustainable, or are we just seeing, again, a tough start to the season when you think about a lot of these guys not getting spring training, not getting extended at-bats? again, other teams are dealing with it much better than the Indians, but they are not a team that has a lot of significantly developed talent in the lineup. You got a lot of young guys, a lot of guys who are coming back from injury or who are really trying to establish themselves as big league players, and that maybe is not the best recipe when you're playing a shortened season and you're trying to throw guys into the mix, right out of the gate. And so at some point you're going to get Tyler Naquin back, and maybe he can give you something, but he's not going to do anything for you, not one thing for you, unless he's 100% healed from that fractured toe. If he tries to come back too soon, it's hard enough to hit in the major leagues. I mean, we're talking about a lot of guys here who are pretty good hitters. And you think about Carlos Santana, Lindor, some of these other guys we've talked about are pretty good major league hitters, and they are scuffling right now. So I don't expect Tyler Naquin to bring much to the table, at least out of the gates. If he's completely healthy, he can probably give you more than what you're getting from Domingo Santana, and certainly more than what you're getting from Daniel Johnson. But we'll see. That's going to be a big question mark moving forward, is how much can Tito, tinker with this lineup. They're probably not going to go out and make a big trade. And so what are you going to do? You've got a lot of young guys, but you've got pitching that can win you games right now. You've got a rotation that can go out every night and give you a chance to win. But unfortunately, at the moment, you don't have a lineup that gives you a chance to win. When this team falls behind 1-0, 2-0, you start to think to yourself, can they even climb out of that? Do they even have enough firepower to get out of a 2-0 hole? And that's crazy. I mean, I know baseball can be, have a game that has some long stretches where teams are scuffling to score runs, and you got to figure out a way to string some things together. But I mean, right now, it is tough sledding. It is tough to watch these guys hit that are not making good contact. They're not taking good cuts. They just don't look like they feel comfortable at the plate. And again, could they, start to develop and start to get into the flow of this season? Yes. Do I think that this team is going to, hit a $190 this season? No, I do not think that. I have seen this too many times with the Indians. Starting off slow, their numbers are always astronomically out of whack to start the season, or they seem to be. The only difference with this season is that you don't have the time that you usually do. You don't have months to get into the groove. You've got to get into the groove now. You got to find a way to just battle through it, and you got to hope that some of these guys get hot, start feeling comfortable at the plate, and really can bring something, more than what we're seeing right now out of this team. All right, so with that, let's jump into our second topic of the day, which is really tied into that first topic, which is how good can the Indians be? How good can the 2020 team be given the current state of the lineup? Given what we know, assuming that they can't go out and make a major trade, there's nobody really that's coming back from injury at any point, other than, as I mentioned, Tyler Naquin, but nobody that really is going to come back and be a game changer for the Indians. And so they'll get Roberto Perez back at some point as well. But again, neither of those guys, Naquin or Perez, is really going to make, in my opinion, a dramatic impact on this lineup or this team's ability to score runs. And so what will this team be capable of, given not necessarily where they're hitting today or what their numbers say today, but just what we know, just looking at this roster, this lineup, and what they could potentially be. What do we expect from this team? How good can they be this season? And will this ultimately be their undoing? And that's the million-dollar question, because we know how good this starting pitching can be. We talked about Shane Bieber, who was flat-out unhittable again in his second start of the season against the Twins. And so, he is going to be a Cy Young candidate probably most of the season. But again, the Indians are asking a lot of Shane Bieber right now. They're asking him to be perfect, essentially, every time he goes out. And they're asking their other starters to be darn near close. And so, yes, do they have one of the better rotations in baseball? They do, but you got to give them something. These guys can't go out there every night expecting to have to win the game 1-0. And so they've got to get some things straightened out. They got to get some things straightened out on the back end of their bullpen. They need Brad Hand to figure it out. Remember, this is the guy they gave up Francisco Mejia to get 2 years ago. He was outstanding in the first half of last season as their closer. He had 23 saves and a 2.17 ERA in the first half of 2019. Brad Hand really fell apart in the second half of last season. He finished the year, the second half, with a 6.08 ERA and a 351 batting average against over the final 2 months of the season. And it seems like that issue, and maybe it's velocity, maybe it's something else, but it seems like that issue has really carried over into 2020. Obviously, his numbers are completely out of whack right now, but he's pitched 2 1/3 innings. He does have 2 saves, but he has a 15.43 ERA to start the season. And so the Indians need to figure that out. They got to hope that Brad Hand can figure it out, because if he can't, you're not going to get anything close to what you gave up in return if you try to trade Brad Hand. And you'd have to turn things over to James Karinchak a lot earlier than what they had expected. You know, he's a 24-year-old. He's pitched really well this season, 5 innings, has not allowed a run yet this season. He has recorded 1 save. He has 8 strikeouts in those 5 innings. But that's a lot. That's a lot to ask of a guy who is essentially a rookie to become your closer. And so I think they need Brad Hand to figure it out. Or they got to hope that somebody around the league thinks that Brad Hand can figure it out and that they can get something meaningful in return for Brad Hand. But to me, you got to figure that out. I think they will figure that out. Bullpen pitchers are weird, right? They're a weird bunch. Guys can go through slumps. They can get hot. I mean, you think about Mariano Rivera and what he did for that long with the New York Yankees. You just don't see that anymore. And certainly not comparing Brad Hand to anyone of that caliber, but I think they'll get it figured out. The rest of these guys in the pen have pitched pretty well so far to start the season. And so I think that they may be able to kind of, shuffle through the back end of the bullpen, and they really need, again, Brad Hand to get it together, because then you can go to Karinchak in the 8th. That means you can go to Whitgren or Simber in the 7th. Throw in Oliver Perez. Again, I still think that they should have another left-hander. There are only 2 left-handers in the pen, being Perez and Hand. But I think they can work through that. The bigger question and the bigger thing they need to focus on is they've got to hit the baseball. And they're getting enough good pitching every game. Sunday was a great example of that. I thought Aaron Savale pitched really well on Sunday against the Twins. A few balls that didn't go his way. You had the one down the line that looked like it barely caught the chalk, or maybe it even didn't. Could have been a foul ball, but we'll say barely caught the chalk for a leadoff double. And then you get a little bloop single going the other way, and all of a sudden it's 1-0. And again, at 1-0, you're starting to go, okay, can the Indians climb out of this hole? Will the bats show up? At least what we saw on Friday and Saturday made you question whether or not they could come back and get out of that on Sunday. And to me, I think you can't really hope to sustain a lot of momentum if that's the mentality that you have. I mean, again, Aaron Savale pitched pretty well in that game. He's pitched pretty well on the season. So he's allowed 5 earned runs in 12 innings, a 3.75 ERA. He has 18 strikeouts and just 1 walk in those 12 innings. And so, you would say, hey, that guy who's, supposedly your number 4, number 5 starter, that's what you're hoping to get out of him. Gotten enough out of Zach Plesac, again, who has only allowed 3 runs in 15 innings. Carlos Carrasco, a little bit shaky over the weekend, but I think you know what you're going to get from him. And so the starting pitching is there. I think they've got enough in the bullpen. You got to hope that Tito and this staff can figure out what to do with Brad Hand. But again, I do not think the Indians have enough hitting to be a true contender. I think that they've got the right manager, the right starting pitching, the right clubhouse environment to be a contender and to put it all together well enough to be right there with the Twins by the time this thing is all said and done. I think they'll get hot. They'll have some stretches where they play good baseball. But I don't think they have enough bats at this point to think that they're going to compete with some of the other teams in the American League, and certainly not the Yankees, even the Red Sox without Mookie Betts, even the Houston Astros, who are not off to the best start. But even teams like that, I just don't think they have enough bats right now. I mean, you're going to expect Carlos Santana and Lindor will get hot. Those guys will end up hitting. But my concern is about the outfield. I just don't see enough guys that can contribute. You have your outfield essentially hitting 6, 7, 8 every game. And you're just not getting anything out of these guys. And then we'll throw Franmil Reyes in, who's your DH. You're really getting nothing out of those guys. I mean, Bradley Zimmer, Oscar Mercado, Domingo Santana, Franmil Reyes, Jordan Luplow, Greg Allen, Daniel Johnson. You're getting almost nothing from these guys. From all those guys I just mentioned, you have 1 home run on the season. That came from Bradley Zimmer. And you're getting almost nothing else. And so that's my concern, and that's been a concern for the Indians for quite some time, is that you're just not getting enough hitting. They don't have those outfielders like they used to have. And that's going to take me into my next segment here. We're going to talk a little bit about an outfielder who they used to have, who they could certainly use a guy of his caliber at this point, and that is the one and only Grady Sizemore. And I saw on Twitter this week, or this past week, that the Indians' Twitter account wished Grady Sizemore a happy 38th birthday. And I'm sure that made people feel very, very old. If you think about that babyface Grady Sizemore playing for the Indians in the mid-2000s. But the good news for the Grady's ladies out there is that I'm sure Grady still looks like he's in his 20s because he's always had that baby face. So wouldn't worry too much about him. But I did want to take a look back on the trade that the Indians made, how they acquired Grady Sizemore. We're going to do this now on pretty much every episode. We'll take some type of look back at something from the history of the Indians. And I thought that given what's going on with this team and given kind of the trade that was made for a guy who ended up becoming one of the best outfielders on the Indians and really one of the best outfielders in baseball for a while, that it would be fun to look back at the trade for Grady Sizemore. So let's take a look back at Grady Sizemore. This was a trade that was made back in 2002. So it feels like forever ago. The Indians had just gone through an incredible run of baseball in the 1990s. They still had a lot of those guys on their team. When John Hart stepped down as the general manager, that's when things started to take a little bit of a different turn. You had Mark Shapiro, who became the general manager of the Indians, who replaced John Hart, and he was in a tough spot. I think that it's easy for us to go back and criticize some of these moves, maybe, or at least at the time we criticized some of these moves, but Mark Shapiro was put in a tough spot. He was handed essentially an incredibly aged roster, and one that they were not really going to be able to afford. When you think about Bartolo Colon becoming a free agent in 2004, he would have been. When you think about Jim Thome, you think about some of these other guys, by that point, you just didn't have the ability to keep this roster together. And so, taking a look back at the trade for Grady Sizemore, the Indians were actually 36-41, so they were 5 games under 500 when they decided to pull the trigger on this trade, which of course was the Indians giving up Bartolo Colon, who had become the ace of that staff. He'd become the guy that they really didn't have in the 90s. Of course, Colon was on that 97 team, but by the time that we got to 2001, 2002, Bartolo Colon had really become the ace of the staff, the guy that the Indians really needed to build around. And so he was having a fantastic season in 2002 at the age of 29. He was 10-4 with a 2.55 ERA in 16 starts. He was on his way to becoming an all-star, and he was leading the American League in innings and complete games, ranked in the league leaders in wins, ERA, strikeouts, shutouts, pretty much everything you could look for. And so he was having a great year for the Indians, but they were still 7.5 games out of first place and 11 games back of the wild card. So the Indians were not in a good position at this point in the season and really felt like they had to make a move. And so this was not the first move that Shapiro had made. And I think that's the key to remember here, that this move, although it was shocking, I remember listening to it on the radio, and it was shocking. When people in Cleveland heard that Bartolo Colon was traded, there was a lot of shock, and people were not happy to see a guy like Bartolo Colon get traded, especially when he was having the season that he was having. And even though the Indians were 7.5 games out of first place, I think people still felt like they were just underperforming, that they were still going to compete, And so there was a lot of shock and awe in Cleveland around that trade. But really, it shouldn't have been as shocking as I remember it to be, because Shapiro had already made a big deal after becoming general manager. So he became the general manager, replacing John Hart in 2001, November 2001, after John Hart stepped down. And one of the first things he did, which is, this is a bold move. This is a move that, again, why Mark Shapiro, I think, has become one of the better front office guys in baseball is because he was willing to make a move like this. Although I think he will tell you, and we'll talk about here, he feels like he didn't go far enough with this move. But the first move that Mark Shapiro made after becoming general manager of the Indians was to actually trade Roberto Alamar. And so you think about that infield with Omar Vizquel and Roberto Alamar, one of probably the most fun infields, middle of the infields that has ever existed, certainly in Cleveland, certainly in my lifetime, but I would suggest in the history of baseball there probably haven't been too many middle infields that were more fun, more electric, better defensively than Omar Vizquel and Roberto Alamar. And so December 11th, 2001, Shapiro trades Roberto Alamar to the New York Mets in a deal that brings back 5 players. The headliner in that deal is Matt Lawton, and that's the piece that I think Shapiro had to learn from. And he did learn from that when we get into the Bartolo Colon trade, was that he wanted to make a move that he felt like would give the Indians the ability to get younger, to reduce some spend, but also to stay competitive in the moment. He did not want, certainly at that point, a month after taking over the job, to start fresh and have a whole new rebuild process that he was going to be in charge of. Obviously, people in Cleveland were not ready for that. And, I still think there's people that look back and feel like they were cut short on their chance to really see this team continue to compete. However, I think we all know that by 2002, the Indians were not built to win a World Series. They just didn't have the talent at that point. A lot of those big names, the Albert Bells, the Manny Ramirez, they had left town. And so I think that Shapiro did what he felt like he had to do, but he actually went back later on and said he didn't feel like he made a big enough trade in terms of the total impact that he thinks he could have had by going for younger players. Matt Lawton being the centerpiece to that trade was the mistake in his mind of trying to stay competitive and yet not getting the value that they really felt like they needed. And so he had a quote where he had said something along the lines of, had they gone all the way, had they felt like they were going to start the rebuild and Roberto Alamar was going to be the first piece, that he was pretty confident that they would have gotten David Wright from the Mets. He said they were talking with the Mets about David Wright, and they felt like they could have easily gotten David Wright as the centerpiece to that trade, but it would have required them to give up on Matt Lawton, and they could have come back with Alex Escobar, maybe Jared Riggin, who they got in the trade, and then David Wright instead of Matt Lawton. And so, I think looking back, that was obviously a deal where if you trade and you end up getting a guy like David Wright, you've got your third baseman for the next decade as soon as he gets to the big leagues. Now, who knows exactly how that plays out, but obviously I think we all would rather go back and have David Wright on the Indians than Matt Lawton. But that was the first trade that he made, and so that really set the table for the follow-up deal, which was, again, the following season when the Indians really fell out of contention, 7.5 games back in the division, another 11 games back in the wild card. That really set the table for Shapiro to make the trade for Bartolo Colon. And so he makes a very dramatic trade for Bartolo Colon, sends him to the Montreal Expos in a deal that really gave them nothing or nobody that people had heard of at the time. The headliner in that deal was Lee Stevens, who was a 34-year-old first baseman who was hitting a $190 that season with 10 home runs and just 31 RBIs. And so that was the guy who, again, if you're following baseball closely, he was not the headliner. But if you're not following baseball, the rest of these guys were just prospects. And Lee Stevens, in every headline, if you go back and search for the Bartolo Colon trade, you'll see a lot of headlines that talk about the Indians trading Colon for Lee Stevens and prospects. And so not a lot of people were super psyched in Cleveland about that trade at the time, getting Lee Stevens and a bunch of young kids back for one of the best pitchers in baseball. But the other thing to remember is that Bartolo Colon was going to be a free agent. So the Indians did have a team option for 2003 for $6 million. So again, they probably could have waited and would have waited another season had they been competitive in 2002. But because they were so far out, they decided that was the time to make the deal. And the one thing that I didn't realize as I started researching the deal was kind of the inside information that Mark Shapiro and the Indians had to make this deal. They had a couple guys that they were working with here in Cleveland, Tony LaCava and Dave Malpass, who both had been part of the Expos organization. Tony LaCava was the director of player development for the Expos in 2000. He joined the Indians front office in 2002. Dave Malpass was a former Expos scout, and he was one of the main guys involved in drafting Grady Sizemore as a 17-year-old out of Cascade High School in Washington. And they actually gave Grady Sizemore a $2 million contract as a third-round pick because, if you remember, Grady Sizemore was going to go play baseball and football at the University of Washington. He was going to go play both football and baseball at the University of Washington. And so it was Malpass and another Expo scout named Scott Goldsby who really talked Sizemore into committing to baseball. Of course, that $2 million didn't hurt. And so, that was a really key piece to this because then LaCava and Malpass both came over to work for the Indians. And so when you think about this trade and how the Indians were able to get not just Grady Sizemore, but also Cliff Lee and Brandon Phillips. So again, Lee Stevens was the headliner to this deal, but Brandon Phillips, Cliff Lee, Grady Sizemore, that is what you call getting fleeced. That is what you call getting taken to the woodshed. And again, could these guys have not panned out? Certainly, that's the idea of trading for prospects, but the Indians had some great inside information from both LaCava and Malpass that really allowed them to win this trade. Although Bartolo Colon, let's not forget, has outlasted all of them. He pitched in the league and was in the league longer than any of the guys that were traded for him, even though he was 29 and Grady Sizemore was only 19 when that trade was made. Bartolo Colon, really proved everybody wrong, but it was those guys, LaCava and Malpass, that knew about Grady Sizemore and wanted to make sure that he was going to be included in that deal for Bartolo Colon. And so, they raved about it. There's an article out there where LaCava talks about the fact that not only did Grady Sizemore have some of the best athleticism he had ever seen, but he was one of the most disciplined teenage hitters that he had ever seen. So these are the scouts that went to see him. They said he had an incredibly advanced strike zone for a guy his age and for a player who grew up in the Pacific Northwest, not exactly known as a baseball hotbed. And so when they saw that and combined that with his off-the-chart athleticism and his drive to be very good, LaCava in an article that he had that I read with Sportsnet in 2017 said that was really what made him feel like they had to get Grady Sizemore in that deal for Bartolo Colon. And so just crazy to think about how those things play out. I mean, the Expos were in a really weird spot as well. They were actually in the other kind of direction. They were 41-36, so they were 5 games over 500 on the day of the trade. They were still 6.5 games back from the Atlanta Braves, but they were in such a weird scenario at that point. Obviously, the Montreal Expos would eventually leave Montreal. They would become the Washington Nationals, and that was really right at the time that this was happening. Jeffrey Loria had left. He had been the Expos owner. He had left and gone to become the owner of the Florida Marlins. And so, that was kind of crazy. Omar Minaya becomes, really the guy calling the shots for the Expos. And there was a crazy quote that I read from Omar Minaya where he said, we just didn't have any scouting reports on Grady Sizemore. That when the Lorias left and went to Florida, they took all the computers, they took all the scouting information with them. And so Minaya had seen Brandon Phillips play and some of these other guys, but had really no clue about Grady Sizemore. And yet you had these guys in Cleveland, LaCava and Malpass, that were very familiar with Grady Sizemore and so wanted to make sure that he was included in that trade. So pretty crazy how that went down. Minaya decides to go all in. Even though they were 6.5 games back in the division race, Minaya goes all in and trying to create some excitement, trying to get the Montreal fans to kind of ignore the fact that the team might potentially be relocating and they're being run at that time by Major League Baseball. And so, that was really kind of their hope in getting Bartolo Colon. Of course, it doesn't pay off, right? The Expos end up going 42-43 down the stretch, and then they stick around for another 2 more seasons in Montreal. But after the 2004 season, they move to Washington, D.C. and become the Nationals. The year before that, they actually traded Bartolo Colon in a 3-team deal with the Yankees and the Chicago White Sox. So they traded Bartolo Colon to the White Sox, which of course are in the Indians division, so that wasn't exactly how the Indians had hoped that would go, but traded Bartolo Colon to the Chicago White Sox in a trade that ended up landing them Orlando Hernandez. And really it was all about the Yankees. The Yankees did not want the Boston Red Sox to get Bartolo Colon, and so they made this deal with the White Sox and the Expos really in an attempt to keep the Red Sox from getting Bartolo Colon. So that's how Grady Sizemore became a member of the Indians. He was 19 years old at the time, and so he was not necessarily having a great season in Single A. He had 26 RBIs and 9 steals, no home runs, hitting .258 in 256 at-bats in Single A that year. But I would say the other guys in that trade at the time were really the more exciting prospects. So Brandon Phillips was 21 at the time, considered by many to be the Expos' top prospect. So the Indians did, in addition to Lee Stevens, really should have been Brandon Phillips, who was the headliner for that trade. He was just crushing the ball in Double-A Harrisburg, hitting .327 with 9 homers, and then he got promoted up to Triple-A. And then Cliff Lee, 23 years old, he was 7-2 in 15 starts in Double-A in Harrisburg, and was leading the league in strikeouts, and really just a guy that was obviously going to become a great major league pitcher in the future, but at the time had a lot of tools, had a lot of things going well for him. So crazy how much the Indians got in return for Bartolo Colon. You get Brandon Phillips at 21 years old, Cliff Lee at 23, and then 19-year-old Grady Sizemore. And so obviously Cliff Lee ends up probably being the headliner to all of that when it's all said and done. Obviously Brandon Phillips had a great career, went on to play probably his best baseball with the Cincinnati Reds. Grady Sizemore was, for a while, one of the most exciting players in all of baseball, at least young players in all of baseball. When you think about that 2005 to 2008 stretch, he was a guy that looked like he was going to be, on the level of like a Mookie Betts. A lot of comparisons between him during that stretch, during that 4-year stretch. He hit .280, averaged more than 25 home runs, 40 doubles, 10 triples, and 115 runs scored during that time. And so also was a guy who could steal you, 20 to 30 bases in a season. And so, this is a guy who really was on his way to becoming one of the best players in baseball. And then the injuries start. Really the ones that, it was a little bit of everything. A lot of different injuries that crept up for Grady Sizemore, but the ones that really took him out of action were the knee injuries. When he had to have microfracture surgery on his knees, that was pretty much it for Grady Sizemore. He didn't appear in a major league game from 2012 to 2013. And then he did make it back into the league, bounced around a little bit with Boston, Philadelphia, and then finished up his career in Tampa Bay, which I do not remember the Tampa Bay years for Grady Sizemore, which was 2014, 2015, before he finally officially hung him up. He was really 26 when those injuries started, and so about 6 years later, he was out of the league completely, retiring from baseball at age 32. But was a tremendous player. I mean, there was a while there where he was one of those guys that everybody turned on the TV, whether you were an Indians fan or not, to watch Grady Sizemore hit the baseball. And, he was comparable, I won't say necessarily in total talent, but he was comparable in interest for a while to a guy like Francisco Lindor. Of course, he was a guy that signed a very team-friendly contract. In 2006, Sizemore signed a 6-year, $23.45 million deal. but he spent the last half of that contract being injured. The Indians were not a very good team during that stretch, did not finish above 500 over his final 3 years with the team. So what could have been? That's one of those all-time, literally all-time, like a Greg Oden type all-time situation when your knees get injured and you're really sapped of that athleticism and that electricity that made him such a great player. That's one of those things where it's always what could have been. But of course, Cliff Lee, he ended up being the crown jewel, in my opinion, of that entire trade. Had an outstanding season in 2008, won the Cy Young Award for the Cleveland Indians with a 2.54 ERA. Really was dynamic for the Indians for a while. And then, that was 2008. He continued to pitch well into 2009. And that actually leads into kind of the final offshoot of the original trade for Bartolo Colon. So they get Cliff Lee in that deal. And then, obviously, that's 2002. And then 7 years later, in 2009, after Cliff Lee wins the Cy Young, the Indians end up trading Cliff Lee to the Philadelphia Phillies. And again, the headliner of that deal is a minor league right-hander named Jason Knapp. Jason Knapp, of course, suffers injuries, never ends up becoming one of those guys that everyone thought he was going to be. But one of the other guys in that trade was a guy named Carlos Carrasco. So Cookie Carrasco, really a byproduct, if you think about it that way, of that original Bartolo Colon trade. They also got Jason Donald and Lou Marzin in that trade. So Lou Marzin never really made it in the show. I think he played maybe 250 games as a part-time catcher, didn't really do much in the big leagues. But Jason Donald, not a name that you probably remember. If you're an Indians fan, that probably doesn't bring back too many memories or really, spark some interest. But Jason Donald actually, again, another piece to kind of the way that the Indians have been able to parlay these trades. Jason Donald was eventually packaged in a deal with the Cincinnati Reds that brought Trevor Bauer and Brian Shaw to Cleveland in 2012. So a decade after that Bartolo Colon trade, they end up getting Trevor Bauer. Now, maybe Jason Donald wasn't the headliner in that deal. The Reds also got someone named Shin-Soo Choo out of that deal. But still, a decade after that Bartolo Colon trade, you have Jason Donald going to the Reds in a 3-team deal. The Indians were also supposed to get Didi Gregorius in that trade, and they ended up flipping him to Arizona as part of the deal for Bauer because they wanted to stick with Asdrubal Cabrera at shortstop. So pretty crazy how those things play out. This front office, has done a tremendous job of finding those guys, the Carlos Carrascos, the Cliff Lees, the Grady Sizemores over the years, and you hope that they continue to find some of those guys. At some point here, they've got to find some outfield help. They've done a great job with the starting pitching. They've done a pretty good job of finding these infielders, but at some point, they've got to find a guy who can consistently hit the baseball, play every day in the outfield, be a middle of the lineup kind of guy. And I know they can't spend $100 million to bring in a star, but I think they've got to find somebody. And I think that at some point they're going to have to spend a little money to make this team competitive for the long term. But we've been saying that for many, many years here in Cleveland now, so I'm not going to hold my breath. But with that, I had planned to get into Mike Clevenger today as my last topic, what was going on with Mike Clevenger, again, who struggled over the weekend against the Twins. But we'll plan to get into that on our next episode, and we'll talk a little bit about the injury for Clevenger, the offseason surgery, and see how much maybe that is impacting Clevenger right now. He really, really struggled in that game against the Twins, only threw 47 of his 88 pitches for strikes, and so I think that's probably a concern. He missed about 2 months of the offseason after having surgery on his left knee for a torn meniscus. And so we'll get into that on a future episode. There's a lot more to cover here, so we appreciate you tuning in. Feel free to send me your questions, thoughts, feedback on the show on Twitter at BcastOhio, or you can tweet the show directly at JustOutsidePod, and would love to hear your thoughts on the show or your questions about the Cleveland Indians. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you tune in again next week.